Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee of Tynwald on Constitutional, Legal Affairs and Justice. I'm Tanya August Phillips, MLC, and I chair this committee. With me are Laurie Hooper, MHK, and Stu Peters, MHK. Before we begin, can you please make sure that your mobile phones are off or on silent? We turn our attention to external relations. Welcome. For the benefit of Hansard and anyone listening, can you please introduce yourselves, including your title and how long you've been in post?
Chief Minister Alfred Cannon, appointed in October 2021.
I'm Chris Brannigan. I'm the Executive Director of Crown and External Relations, and I've been in post since the middle of November 2024.
Lovely, thank you very much. Have either of you got an opening statement that you wish to make?
I can certainly give you an update. So since we appeared before the committee in April last year, the government has published a global relations strategy to provide a clearer framework for how we prioritise and deliver external engagement. We've continued to work pragmatically with the UK government, particularly through the Ministry of Justice and relevant Whitehall departments, to protect the island's constitutional position and national interests. We've continued to monitor developments arising from the UK-EU reset process that has been publicised and engage early on issues that may affect the island's interests and our long-standing customs relationship with the UK. We have progressed our work on transparency and the anti-money laundering and combating financial terrorism frameworks, including the beneficial ownership arrangements for obliged entity access, and we're committed towards working through the legitimate interest access to registers in line with international standards, and preparations also underway in terms of the 2026 general election, including the legislative and regulatory changes intended to modernise and improve transparency and efficiency. I would say that there have been four critical areas of work that have continued throughout this period. First of all, liaison and discussions with the UK government in relation to offshore wind and its relationship and accessibility to the UK supply chain, beneficial ownership, our compliance with international standards, and our Moneyval assessment. British Irish Council, proper representation of the island's interests at British Irish Council, an affirmation of our self-governance, and then general governmental matters, which includes free trade agreements and, as I mentioned, the UK-EU reset process.
Is there anything that you'd like to? No. Okay. So, Mr. Brannigan, when we heard from you on the 7th of April 25, you'd been in post a few months only. So we're nearly a year on. Has your view of the island changed at all? And what's needed?
No, my view of the island hasn't changed. I think when I started the process and we spoke last year, I had been starting to shape some of what I thought the island might need to position itself for, and some of the themes on which it might engage more closely with external enablers. I think the situation around which the island might find itself in obviously has changed. We are responsive to geopolitical activities. So my view of the island hasn't changed, but the context in which the island finds itself has obviously changed over the space of the last 12 months.
And you'd have to change sort of tack or plan in order to fit?
Yeah, so I think last year when the Chief Minister and I appeared here, we had said that the publication of the Global Relations Strategy, which had been scheduled for July, was designed to be as agile as possible. So it was a first attempt at defining more of where we thought the island could take itself forward in response to differing circumstances and differing activities, whilst maintaining our perspective on achieving the island's national interest. And a significant number of things have sort of happened since then, both sort of economically, in terms of conflict, in terms of external events on which we tend not to be active participants in, but which we are active recipients of, whether that's changing oil prices, for example, and sort of most recent examples, tariff situation that had gone on, which I think has sort of emerged over the last 12 months or so. How will those sort of things affect the United Kingdom and our neighbouring jurisdictions, and therefore how it has an effect upon us?
How is external relations achieving the goals that you you wish for it to achieve, and what's your proudest achievement thus far?
I think it's normally quite difficult to measure what it is that we're working toward. We do a lot of preventative work. There's quite a lot of discussion that can sort of take place that means that something which is a small scale issue doesn't become a much bigger one, and therefore it's a bit like being a goalkeeper. You know, you're stopping it from going through. You tend not to get the same reflected glory that the centre forward does when you're knocking them into the opponent's net, but you do stop things happening that damage your overall chances of competing. So I think the long enduring and engagement that we've run on, for example, looking at offshore energy and our inclusion in UK legislation for offshore energy, for example, has been something that's been fundamentally transformed over the sort of space of the last 8 months or so, from what had been a non-inclusion into UK legislation, which has not yet passed, but which we have been involved in the discussion about how we might shape, to something that looks to be a much more favourable position for the island as a whole, for our energy future and potentially our energy sovereignty. So looking at something that I guess is probably an achievement that we can also take some pride in, tend to be those that have got longer term benefits for the island's economic security in a number of different manifestations.
But if you were able to add the proactive into the mix, what would that look like for you, and how would you get there?
Do you mean in terms of the activities that we undertake?
You talked about a lot of sort of reactive,
Sure.
So I'm asking, I suppose, blue sky wise, what would it look like?
So I suppose the one thing that we're always very keen to lean into is ensuring that the UK government is very clear about the constitutional independence and constitutional status of the island. That's something we lean into and we incorporate as part of our themes, our communication themes. We make sure that for every meeting that we hold, there's a very clear set of objectives and outcomes that we want to have from each of those meetings, and that's almost always includes ensuring that our constitutional independence is recognised by UK officials or UK politicians that we happen to be talking to within our sort of meetings.
And so how are those monitored? Sorry, the outcomes that you said that that you're looking for from each meeting. So the actions that are taken away.
Yep.
How are those then monitored and evaluated?
So we. As I said, the enduring nature of what our engagement leads to. So if I was to give you an example, it's like sort of anonymised. If we wanted to deliver a particular objective, let's say on, refer back to energy as a good example, we would look to have an outcome that would say, could we have a guarantee or a certainty of inclusion in helping to inform the legislative process that might be coming up in the UK Parliament in the coming 9 months, to give us to give the island the opportunity to be able to ensure our interests were representative, as any other Crown dependency would do. We tend to leave with an outcome that says, well, can we have a guarantee of when that might sort of happen by? Is there a 3-month time frame on it, a 2-month time frame on it? Is it going to be 6 months further down the line? Having that as an achievable outcome would then allow us to regularly engage with that particular ministry or channel through the Ministry of Justice to ensure that we're able to ensure that it maintains momentum, that it continues to work toward the same agreed objective that we had mutually settled on, and that we could then look at where we could then reinforce that particular strand of activity. So it's strategic in that we might say, well, we'd want to engage with particular individuals, we want to engage with particular officials, we'd want to look at how else we can sort of publicise the benefit that would occur to both of our jurisdictions for our mutual benefits and meet both of our national interests. We'd look at key spots that might come along out of sequence. So, for example, at the British Irish Council, Chief Minister always gets an opportunity to be able to speak to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, as well as the leaders of devolved administrations and the Taoiseach. It forms a theme of how we're progressing and how we maintain momentum. So we can say we've had these discussions, we've mutually agreed that this is the path and the objectives that we want to work toward. We can keep giving it energy to make sure that it works towards our ultimate objective.
So a lot of these actions have got a life cycle almost, so you can come back to them and then start evaluating from that point.
Yeah. So it's it would be unusual if we were to go to a single meeting with a single outcome to realise a single objective. They tend to be things that have been identified sometime in advance, that sit out, that say there is at least a 12-month perspective on this, if not longer. In the case of energy, that's something which is, has got a decades-long perspective on it. We're looking to see what we can put into place in effect all of the time to maintain momentum toward the realisation of a national objective.
I think, as you've explained pretty well, external relations is very much the long game here. It's slow, it's steady. You don't want to be shifting positions every 5 minutes on issues. How do you communicate that to government departments? Obviously, we've had lots of ministerial changes, lots of changes in policy decisions that happen. It's the nature of the beast. How do you make sure that some of the global relations longer-term strategies you've talked about aren't impacted, and that other departments, other parts of government actually are on the same track with that kind of long-term thinking and long-term approach?
So I provide regular updates both to ENSB, where I'm sort of standing item, external relations are a standing item on the agenda, to the Chief Officers Group, to ensure that's passed through. I meet regularly. I brief the Chief Minister, Chief Executive, and Chief Operating Officer fortnightly on all planned activity. So there are three paths for communication within there as well, and we would be responsive to any particular issue that came in from a particular department that would be within their own responsibility. So recent examples have included talking about fishing in Northern Ireland, for example, talking about energy in particular, and as part of ensuring there's an alliance, there's one small example we can use, which is a matter of weeks ago, perhaps 5 or 6 weeks ago, Minister Barber, along with the Deputy Chief Operating Officer, along with the Energy Policy Advisor, and myself, all went to a British Irish Council ministerial energy meeting, so we can ensure that there is this absolute alliance. A, I'm able to support Minister Barber and her team. B, we're able to ensure that we're all working towards the same objectives. There's a reinforcing element of that is brought into effect, rather than it just being a ministerial responsibility or departmental responsibility. External relations sitting at the centre are able to ensure that it's not straying out of bounds. It's always on track, but it's not straying. There's no divergence in there that would be unnecessary.
It's quite ad hoc. Dealing with departments, you mentioned DNSB. Is there any point where you brief or update council ministers as a whole, and to make sure that as a whole, council ministers are still on the same long-term approach that you've described?
No, I tend not to do that. Although that information does go in via sort of chief executive and chief operating officer, and of course through the chief minister as well.
So you're quite reliant then on departments identifying things that have an external focus and bringing you into the room
we
to
tend
get
to have
support.
Sure, we tend to have we don't publicise sort of horizon scanning, because of the length of time that's involved in that. So it tends not to be reactive events. It tends to be, this is where the mega trend is heading towards. For example, in AI or in energy sovereignty, something that is decades in its development. But we are responsible. We aim to be responsive to anything that's brought up as a sort of short-term measure that we can then give it our sort of fullest attention to and prioritise within that.
Do you have an understanding of where those things kind of sit as sort of like a risk assessment, if you get what I mean? So, like, say, for example, back in 2018, moving into 2019, there were the bycatch, the directive that DEFRA were expected to adhere to for the January, I think it was 2019. And I think it was me and Laurie, actually, at the time I'd just been elected, that ended up bringing external relations into the room, because they previously weren't in the room, and they would have missed that deadline if they hadn't have gotten everything in place before that point. So is that I'm just using that as an example, but that type of thing, like a risk assessment across the piece of where there may be risks in and around departments that could affect your overall strategy.
There's no formal register for that. So there's no formal mechanism that would say, actually, this features really highly on our list of priorities that we'd like you to pay attention to, and we do miss things. That's been part of it. So there's been discussion recently over BSE and Blue Tongue that had just been missed. When we go back via the Ministry of Justice to talk to DEFRA in the UK, they'll say, we just in the sort of post-Brexit a reorganisation of UK ministerial departments, they just forgot to tell all the Crown dependencies. We shouldn't feel as though we were singled out. They forgot to tell all of them and failed to pick that through. Those mistakes then become compounded over time. When we do spot them, we are able to intervene, and in fact, not last week, but the week before, as part of our sort of quarter one engagement, we were able to bring those up with Minister Richards, who offered to write to Minister Reynolds at DEFRA to raise exactly that piece to accelerate and mitigate the risk that might be felt on the island as a consequence.
But of course, as there's sort of a high turnover politically, there's also a high turnover in the civil service as well, over in the UK, across UK departments, and that continual reaffirmation of the island's independence and our, constitutional nature. It must be a very arduous task to keep on top of that, I would imagine.
And it is a continuous process. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, politicians generally have a reasonably short shelf life. But it has been particularly so in the United Kingdom for a number of reasons over recent years, and you do, literally have to keep reinforcing the message, and quite a lot of the time re-explaining the position and what you represent in terms of the island's constitutional position, the self-governance, the way our legislative processes work, our interaction with the United Kingdom, and I think part of that re-emphasis is so that people properly understand what and how to deal with issues when they arise, and I guess ultimately to prevent us reaching an escalation point if there are issues of contention, such as, for example, beneficial ownership and open registers and international matters and standards, or so that you can properly recognise opportunities, particularly obviously energy. And we keep talking about this, but clearly one of the limitations, if Ørsted were to get its planning approval, would be its capability to supply energy to the UK grid. We've had a lot of representation on that in that space. And as Mr. Brannigan has said, I hope that very shortly we'll be able to confirm that we have made progress, and the UK are taking that as much more seriously now, and are prepared to take the necessary legislative steps forward to enable that to happen in the future, should of course that get the relevant permissions over here.
Okay.
Just says the committee should be a bit careful talking about offshore wind as there is the equivalent of a planning process going on at the minute, as I understand it. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's not to judge the application per se, but to simply look at how that would ultimately end up should application be granted. But yeah.
So just going back to the global relations strategy, in July 2025 we published that strategy. The strategy says it'll be put before the Council of Ministers annually, review and publication date centred on Tynwald Day. Why was the strategy not laid before Tynwald?
I think, my understanding from it, the strategy was designed to be a high-level statement of how global relationships work in practice, rather than being a document that, charts a sort of new course for the island. It was designed merely to be informative rather than for it to go before Tynwald. And I think my recollection of it is that going before the Council of Ministers and then to be briefed out to Tynwald members was the compromise that had been agreed at the time. That's my recollection.
Is that something that you would still be happy with, Chief Minister?
With hindsight, I think it probably could have been laid before Tynwald. I'm not quite sure from recollection why that process didn't happen, but certainly should have, and happy to commit to ensure that future versions are laid before Tynwald properly.
Yeah, it seems to make an awful lot of sense. What do you see as the role, and I suppose that this would be a question for you, Chief Minister, a role for Tynwald in terms of external relations and external relations strategic direction? Do you think it's a role for us to a matter for us to debate in the chamber? Do you think it's useful, relevant?
Well, I think it's quite a hard one necessarily, to sort of attach actual specifics. I mean, it is about relationships. It's about building those relationships. It's about dealing with the issues of the day. Those issues of the day can either be foreseen, so there is a clear sort of pathway towards achieving an objective, such as, for example, things like beneficial ownership or energy, and or they are issues that arise, you know, in the moment, if that's the right word, and need immediate resolution. So in some respects, you know, you can set an overall sort of framework, I think, around a commitment to have a strong external relations present, an agenda set out in terms of representation, I think political representation, whether that's done by the Chief Minister or an appointed minister. You know, but the fundamentals around it, I mean, it's not an item I would suggest of significant expenditure. You know, there's obviously a budget that is set aside for it. The value of sort of, I guess, Tynwald debating it is hard to assuage, but certainly, I mean, I think, you know, if there were items that Tynwald could at least see, and I take the point about laying this before Tynwald, you know, I think then obviously members have the ability to be able to pick it up. I think an annual a trip to a scrutiny or to the scrutiny committee is probably an appropriate way to look at it. As I say, I think if there's fundamental matters of specific national interest, then Tynwald may have a view on those on those matters. But
one of the things the strategy talks about is trying to present a coherent and consistent narrative to the outside world. This actually came up in Tynwald quite recently, where we had a now minister, but then backbencher, severely criticising the role of one of our regulators on the island in a very public forum in Tynwald Court or in the House of Keys. Do you not think that perhaps engaging with politicians through a Tynwald process of some sort would help build and deliver on that coherent and consistent narrative, rather than having people, you know, actually not being able to follow that because no one really understands what narrative it is that you're trying to build, what level of coherence you're looking for, and actually you lose some of that by not engaging with members who maybe then don't have a fuller understanding of the way things are going and some of the work that's ongoing internationally?
you mean discussing more in terms of what I guess the sort of underpinning objectives are of having an international relations strategy.
In there you talk about things like growing the island's reputation as being a responsible jurisdiction and regulatory alignment. Some of that broader context I think might help better inform other debates that happen in Tynwald and try and help people, like I say, present that consistent narrative in an outside facing, in a public format at least.
I think it's I've been very conscious over the course of the last 12 months or so about how much of an emerging narrative it is. And one of the things that I feel that we respond to quite well is that we often don't get to choose the terms of the engagement that we receive off island, and the three areas that we feel that people are very responsive to off island tend to be over the issues of how we are pursuing a clean energy strategy, how we can champion the UNESCO biosphere status, and therefore the cleanliness of our environment and any number of different manifestations of that. And in our approach toward compliance and regulatory standards for us as an international finance centre. So we tend to find that those are the three things that tend to be brought up. So there is always a sort of shaping that looks at, as we use it as a working term, clean energy, clean environment, clean money. There's a whole approach toward that. This is actually, we are regulated by, we pass every benchmark that's due to come our way about how we work as an international finance centre, about what our regulatory approach is, what we do within the cleanliness of our environment, why we attract business to the island as a consequence of that. And so in those sort of emerging themes, that narrative, you're trying to find something that hooks in people's imaginations off island, is memorable and repeatable. We're looking to run a whole network of soft advocates off island, and having something which is catchier rather than being necessarily sort of substantiated in other sort of spaces tends to work easier, because it's a hook for them to be able to then engage with other people on our behalf.
And I think the other point, that probably should make is that yes, you can have some sort of clear foundations about representing the island, explaining the island's position, protecting its constitutional relationship, but also not every conversation is either straightforward or the same, and they have to be adapted and adopted to whoever you're talking to. You know, for one day you might be with the EU ambassador, and that may be a whole different sort of conversation piece, and then one day you may be with an MP who is particularly always pursuing an agenda that is probably against the Manx national interest, and you're perhaps having a debate and putting forward a case as to, you know, what the island is currently doing, but also why that particular argument may not carry the substance that particular person thinks it is. So, you know, I think that within that context, there's absolutely some foundations, and I think they have been set out. Those foundations have been set out, but as you might imagine, when you're carrying out the when you're carrying out the engagement piece, whether you're at British Irish Council down at Westminster, or attending, for example, functions or engagements in the Northwest, there's a very different element often to the conversation and what you're trying to achieve from it, and that's not always necessarily definable in advance. You know, a lot of the time you are obviously knowing the meeting's coming up, you're setting your objectives, but they're not necessarily something that you might have written down on a piece of paper 6 to 12 months previously.
If I could just sort of add to the Chief's point, we're looking to establish relationships with an extraordinarily varied set of individuals off the island, and every one of those requires a sort of bespoke solution to ensure that whatever they're interested in and we're interested in can be aligned to take, as we say, whether by a great degree or by a smaller degree, the island's national interest that little bit sort of further forward. So there is always a sort of set of themes that sit within the engagement. As I said, you know, we don't have a meeting unless we've got a set of outcomes and objectives that we're looking to achieve. Otherwise, there's no point in having it. But it does require an awful lot of specific tailoring for the individuals that we tend to be engaged with, and with groups that can be a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, we've always been very much in favour of that, this committee, with, you know, the individuals off island that can advocate for us in a positive way like that.
So actually that leads us on quite nicely, talking about measures and metrics.
Yeah.
The international relations strategy came out around about the same time as the department plan for the Cabinet Office. And inside that, you obviously, external relations had a number of measures, KPIs, you refer to them as SMART objectives. How are you planning on reporting on those? Because like the Chief Minister just said, it's difficult sometimes to set some objectives, but actually you did manage that for external relations.
So I report in through the Cabinet Office plan to the Cabinet Office board at ELT every month on what we're achieving, what we're not achieving. So we measure that sort of up against our objectives. There's a degree of assessing those before we get to the next Cabinet Office plan to work out exactly what it is we have succeeded on and what we have done less well on than and there are two things that I can think of straight away which we'd set out as quite ambitious objectives for ourselves and which haven't quite reached the point in which we would like them to do, but broader on everything else. You know, we can provide the numbers in terms of our engagements. We look at the level of engagement that we're involved in. We look at how we've moved a particular piece further forward, whether that's through DEFRA, for example, as we mentioned earlier, about ensuring that there is some concrete objective that's been achieved. But I have a monthly reporting basis into the Cabinet Office through ELT, quarterly assessments, and then an annual review as we start to rewrite the next version of the Global Relations Strategy.
Yeah, I think that's probably the appropriate place to try to produce a report. I think, you know, we haven't really had a formal report in the past. I think it's appropriate. You've got, you know, you've had the first strategy laid, well, not laid before, but it's in the public domain. And then I think a report on the previous year, what it's achieved, what meetings have taken place, where and in what context, I think is an appropriate place. As again, I mean, sort of putting in that sort of smart measurement against everything is not necessarily that easy. But I think, you know, certainly we could sit here today and define 2 or 3, possibly 4 clear outcomes, I think, from the work that we've been doing in terms of the meetings that we've been undertaking. And, you know, relate those directly to legislation or impacts that we are feeling here on the island one way or another.
I mean, it's good to start thinking about outcomes rather than just metrics. I think that's quite
Yeah.
positive. But like I said, in that strategy, the department plan as was, there were a number of very specific things. Most of them were around increasing the level of engagement. So it was around activity, which I think it's only part of the picture. It'd be interesting to know where you've baselined that data and where you're at now. So if you do have one of those quarterly reports you could share with the committee, that would be quite useful, I think, just to get an understanding of what is being reported on back to the Cabinet Office. And then obviously I would expect as part of the Island Plan reporting process, there'll be an annual update to Tynwald at some point on the whole Cabinet Office plan, which would then reflect some of that. I'm right in thinking that, I'm assuming. Okay. As part of the global relations strategy, there's a reference in there as well talking about the island's economic strategy and continuing to work closely with DFE to build relationships with key political and commercial partners to enhance existing economic ties or create new connections in order to support the island's interest and achieve the Island Plan objectives. Can you talk about what sort of partners are intended here in that phrase and actually how that engagement has been going?
Do you mean economic partners off island that we would be engaged with, or do you mean on island, Mr. Hooper?
Well, the language in your plan simply says key political and commercial partners. I'm assuming that means on and off island, but I leave it to you. It's your plan.
Sure. So firstly, on island, we have so ENSB. There is a regular, there's an integrated schedule of engagements, both from DFE and from external relations. So we're looking to bring together and provide some degree of extra heft to who we're talking to politically, for example, on behalf of an on-island commercial interest. So our recent engagements with DEFRA, for example, have represented the interests of cattle owners, cattle owners, farmers, excuse me. Simply to sort of like a text analogy going on in my head there for a moment, but for cattle breeders here on the island to make sure that access for meat products off the island, for example, that's part of that ongoing engagement with DEFRA. So it tends to be a coordinated piece in advance. It tends to be where we brought it up at ENSB to say, look, you've got political meetings, or you can generate political meetings that would enable us to get past this regulation that affects the commercial interests on the island. So we work on towards their task, as it were. By the same token, if we know that there's a particular development strand that's being run by, let's say, Digital Isle of Man, for example, that gives us an opportunity to be able to say, well, we can lean into it. At the moment, we've got a particularly good relationship, or we've got a less good relationship, we've got no relationship with DCMS within the UK. What would you like us to do to enable your goals and your priorities to be met that we can put into effect for you? Those can be in emerging technologies, so they can be in the space of AI, they can be in the space of power generation, they can be in anything that is that DFE essentially feed in toward us. So rather than a specific, I've generalised over those discussions. We're the enabling facility. We're the enabling power that sit within that raise the case. Whether we do that generally or specifically, once we have that in mind, we can put that forward as part of our engagement outcomes.
Yeah, I guess probably to give you two clear examples, sort of on a governmental level where there will be economic benefit. There's obviously the free trade agreements where we've lobbied hard and pushed hard proactively to be included. CPTPP being the first one, or I guess the benchmark to which we've been included for goods and continue to seek a review to be included for services. The most recent one with the Gulf Cooperation Council is clearly now going to be put on hold for a while. But again, there's obviously clearly Manx businesses doing business in that region. Again, tangible benefits are quite hard to identify, i.e. the very specific sort of value of being included, but there would be, we think, both from ourselves and the Crown Dependencies perspective, Jersey and Guernsey, it would give us added resonance in terms of representation in that region. So they're the clear ones from a governmental level. I think as part of our engagement process, we have also looked to meet with business representatives at a senior level to talk about, so from commercial institutions and organisations that may have links or may not have links to promote or to discuss how that business is being conducted and to try and take those opportunities. We are currently examining, we haven't done it for a long time, I think 3 years or so ago I hosted a dinner in London with a collection of potential business leads, if that's the right word, senior individuals from the City of London, where we look to try and promote the island. I also did that, I think, in conjunction with DFE, and we're just currently looking at doing one more of those this year. So those are the type of real examples where we're trying to bring the presence of the job we're doing in external relations, my role almost to sort of give that step in for Department of Enterprise to build, but also to lead, government to government to build that trading relationship with it, which interestingly enough, the UK government themselves have identified as the Crown dependencies, providing, I think it was at 14% of foreign direct investment.
10% of all foreign direct investment by value into
the UK. It's coming through the Crown dependencies, which is quite a significant figure, and that's also a platform for further exploration in terms of how both our value in terms of working together with the UK, but as a base to push us forward when it comes to things like free trade agreements.
So can I ask then, after you've successfully managed to get the Isle of Man included in a free trade agreement, CTPP for example, how do you then communicate that to industry? How do you then make sure the benefits of that are actually being felt on Ireland? Or from your perspective, do you kind of put DFE in touch and then you just hand back the reins and say, right, you guys off and deal with this?
So essentially that, we're there to enable that. We're there to find the relationships, to build the relationships, to maintain the relationships, to sustain them. And then once having facilitated those, it's really whoever the deliverer is, the executive of that, to come in and make the most of it. We can represent for them, but we're never going to be, external relations are never going to be able to do the same, detailed job or expert job that parts of the DFE are able to go and do. So there's a degree of hands off at that stage, this trip, in terms of what we then allow them to sort of go and do, and then come back to support them as necessary.
So how then do you said a few times it's hard to measure tangible success on these things, which is fair, I think. But there would be a kind of a sense of success, businesses out there who will know they've benefited or otherwise. Yes. How do you gather that sort of feedback to understand whether what you're doing is actually benefiting Manx businesses on the ground? I think it's hard to say we've created 5 new jobs and 6 new businesses. It's quite hard to track that level of detail. But actually there would be a sense out there from some of these companies as to, yes, actually, this happened, and as a result we're better off or worse off or whatever. How do you gather that sort of feedback, and what sort of feedback have you had in that space from local businesses?
So if you're not getting it right, people tend to tell you pretty quickly that what you're providing is of no value whatsoever, and you need to adjust that. But it does tend to be soft. There isn't a formal mechanism for being able to bring that through, and I think all jurisdictions find the same challenge. All nations sort of find the same challenge, that how do I know, where do I get that degree of investment from? To give you an example, in the United Kingdom there is a marketing campaign called GREAT, and it promotes the United Kingdom globally. It tends to have a footprint in every major embassy around the world. If there's a trade trip, they'll tend to be sort of part of it. So they can describe how much they've spent on it, and they can describe what it's broadly worth in terms coming back into the economy. But I know that they struggle to find precisely where the impact is, like whether it comes into the creative industries, or whether it comes into petrochemicals, or whether it comes into life sciences, where exactly that's brought through unless it sits as a strand. So we know there's always challenges of being able to say we've definitely resulted in like 10 extra jobs. Again, it's back to the goalkeeper analogy. We tend to be able to say, well, we've stopped that thing from happening or from getting any worse, rather than necessarily being able to put an achievement. But the mechanism by which we hear that back tends to be either people giving us that was good, well done, thank you very much. At which point, given the amount of capacity, the external relations team, we just tend to sort of leave it at that, and then move on to sort of the next task, as that rolls on, rather than being able to chart that up and say, actually, we saved 10 jobs here or created 20 jobs there. There are bigger pieces, but DFE are essentially the people who do the hard work in that space, and I think that's where both the credit and the metric tends to be due.
So the way you would gather feedback from exporters, from farmers, from whoever it is that's benefiting from the work that you do, would be via the DFE and via their feedback mechanisms predominantly.
For the division, for the division officially, it's back to the DFE.
But it goes kind of back to what we were talking about before. So, if DEFRA has an issue, which they have had recently as we've well publicised issue, I mean, that contact has gone department to department.
Yeah.
External relations have been sort of kept in the loop, and in fact, I think we've played a role certainly in going to the Ministry of Justice and saying, look, we've got an example where there's been a failure in communication here. What do we need to do to continue to make sure the island is being sort of properly represented in Whitehall? So that's certainly one way we would find out about either success or problems, because it gets raised, it gets raised with us. And secondly, I think, I guess there is some potential view on this in terms of looking at any export figures that are available. I think particularly when it comes to European Union, you're talking about fish export specialist scallops, for example, which I know reach the EU, and indeed some special meat exports, and then of course you've got your manufacturing exports as well, and supply chain. So I guess those issues would be probably flagged from having not achieved a smooth pathway in terms of whatever routes were available to UK businesses, and in making sure that we're also got that same opportunity for Manx-based businesses to reach into those markets.
Like as a division, you're more like firefighters. You're dealing with problems as they arise to try and mitigate the impact, or to try and stop them happening again, to try and fix problems, as opposed to the opposite. You're trying to be more proactive.
A little bit. I'd say we might be more akin to the sort of, the insurance company that are there when the fire breaks out. There's lots of things that we can sort of put into place to ensure that, when an incident does occur, that the consequences of it are as limited as possible. So if we come back to our core objectives, which are being able to ensure that there is a network of relationships at all levels across as broad a spread as possible, we've always got someone who we have got a warm relationship, a sustained relationship that we can engage with to ensure that things happen more swiftly, more promptly, can be resolved more efficiently than they would have been if we were starting to begin something from scratch.
But from a risk management point of view, I mean, earlier, I'll just be perfectly blunt about it, I'm sorry. but you seem to the cogs seem to turn a little bit when we talked about like a register across government of various different issues. Do you think that there's any benefit in having one of those, that type of risk register that's then continually updated by departments that everybody has access to, so it gives you a good indication of where things are and what problems may or may not arise?
There can be. I wouldn't be certain whether or not that be something that ought to necessarily sort of sit within our responsibility within the Cabinet Office, or whether it just sits within the sort of Cabinet Office as a whole, or whether it sits at ENSB to look at where those big flagged issues are. That does tend to sit within that space. So we're never unaware of those things going on. We tend not to be blindsided unless something absolutely comes up that is beyond all of our controls, such as the BSE regulations piece that could not have been foreseen.
No.
Those tend to be black swan events coming in when they happen.
So just moving on, Chief Minister, the forward in the Global Relations Strategy, July 25. In the preceding 6 months, you re-established the Manx all-party parliamentary group. What's the value of that group? What value is there in it?
I think its value comes from a broader range of engagement. It's a cross-party group. A lot of our relationship and a lot of our meetings tend to take place with the party in power at the time for sort of fairly obvious reasons. We do obviously try to engage across other parties as well, the opposition, the official opposition, but also other parties where appropriate. I think the APPG gives us a broader range of individuals in terms of the breadth of party reach that we are meeting. But again, I think the value of the APPG comes to its fore when there is a matter of urgent importance, Perhaps normally, actually, I think history would tend to say when there has been an attempt by Westminster to try and legislate for the island in particular, or where the island has been perhaps unfairly put at the centre of attention. And we would obviously seek from the APPG representation on the floor of Westminster on behalf of the island, and that's where the real value comes. There's also that, as I said, that educational piece, that representative piece that those individuals will bring to the engagement and bring to be of value to us as an island.
And what tangible outcome have you seen of the APPG thus far? Have we had a crisis big enough for there to be a tangible outcome, do you think?
Well, I think the fact that we haven't had one recently, I perhaps might say, is evidence of having had a pretty strong period of representation, of making quarterly trips down to Westminster, of really being in a position, I think, actually, where we've been discussing some real tangible issues of significant benefit to both the UK and the Isle of Man. And I haven't got right at this precise time a clear example. I think it is some years since we've had an occasion when there has been an attempt or threat to legislate. That threat, I think, doesn't go away. There are certainly MPs in Westminster who believe that the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories should be legislated for. And that representation comes through at time to time on specific issues.
And Mr. Peters, I think you want to speak at the London office.
We talked last year, I think, about the idea of a London office, or certainly better, London representation. And you said at the time that we continue to look at it and consider it. What progress has been made, or is it in the long grass somewhere?
I think it's fair to say that within resourcing constraints, it's in the long grass. We do take an updated look at London rental costs. We do look at the benefit that the other Crown dependencies use. For example, Jersey, maintain an office in London. Guernsey don't. We look at whether the value, to that sort of continues to be something that we'd want to be able to go and invest in. I still think, it's still my view, that the engagement that we have, that we require in Westminster, which tends to be for a limited number of weeks per year, it's in the UK parliamentary term, it tends to be for a limited number of days per week. Essentially, you will get parliamentary engagement Tuesdays through to Thursdays and not on Mondays or Fridays. And we tend to get a degree of extra engagement outside of Westminster. So, for example, the party conferences, which this year have been sort of Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham, make it difficult to justify how we would have to invest in the order of several £100,000 to be able to establish a London office. We get much more bang for our buck by being more agile and resourcing our engagement at those other events rather than just doing it in London all the time.
Okay. According to the overview of the Public Sector Workforce Report for the fourth quarter of 2025, Crown and External Relations team gained a member in the last quarter of 2025, bringing it up to 32. Is this enough?
It is at the moment. It is at the moment. I think that along with all of our posts, we'll stop and evaluate them to ensure that there's a view. Anyone we've recruited in recent periods have all been subject to an assessment, all been subject to an employment review, to ensure that we're still getting there's a valid purpose for that sort of particular employee. Everyone will always say, well, of course I could always do with more, but there is no more. So we make the most of what we've got. We work on our staff development. We try to ensure that all members of staff get inclusions in understanding the bigger, broader picture. There tends to be a sort of greater degree of involvement. There tends to be a little degree of ensuring that you can understudy the person above you, so that there's a greater degree of contextual understanding within those roles. In the election team, there is a requirement for more temporary staff at the moment, but that's because we're heading towards general election. But outside of that, I think we've got, the people we've got are talented, they're capable, they understand the broader context, and they can cope with the amount of work that's coming their way.
So do you think you've got the resources to do what you know you need to do and act more proactively?
I think that's always true at any given moment in time. At this moment in time, that we have enough people to do what we ought to do. Whether the situation to change or whether to be, some significant uplift in a requirement. As I say, we are subject to the actions of other geopolitical players. That then we would come back and ask to review that. But at the moment, we've got enough of what we're doing.
So just moving on to security. Reports recently issued by BIPA committee about UK-EU defence and security cooperation. They sent it to you and they've sent it to us.
Yes.
Have you responded? Or will you respond?
I think my recollection is that we didn't specifically respond, the External Relations team didn't specifically respond to it because I thought that we had felt that it was a parliamentary issue rather than a Cabinet Office issue. I think that had been our...
Oh, you think we should have responded then, perhaps?
I can't relate. I'm just looking at my notes here to see exactly what we did.
Flipping the table around, Mr. Brannigan.
Exactly, to see exactly how that response had gone through, or whether it required a response at all. We listened and read through the report and thought about what the consequences were for us on the island and what actions we ought to be able to take through, particularly between ourselves and our neighbours, in terms of securing the island's borders. In looking at the purpose that had sort of sat behind the report itself, but I don't recollect that we specifically responded to that report.
Right. Okay. And there's no intention to do so because that's felt it's more a parliamentary matter.
I don't think so. I think there was a response that came through the. That might have come through the committee, but I'll check with my team and see exactly what the status is of the of that piece.
There are a number of useful pointers in there for us. Perhaps it might have been worth maybe picking some of those out and responding.
I think the ongoing discussion that had gone on around the island's infrastructure and security arrangements.
Infrastructure.
Constabulary arrangements with UK policing. I think we've taken about sort of 6 or 7 observations out of the BIPA report, but I don't think we responded to BIPA specifically.
Okay, so that report, there is only one specific reference to the Isle of Man in that report. It was actually evidence given by the UK's National Crime Agency saying they had a very good relationship with the island. As I think as a committee we found that a little surprising, given that the whole report was about security of critical infrastructure, subsea cables, maritime patrols, common travel area, and the fact the Isle of Man wasn't considered overly. There's no evidence provided by the Isle of Man, and now we're hearing no response from the Isle of Man either. Do you not think that is a potential gap here, if you have these British Islands-wide bodies dealing with some of these issues which are cross-border in their very nature? I mean, we have a subsea cable that goes from our waters to foreign waters. Actually, they're all engaged in these conversations around protecting that infrastructure, but the Isle of Man isn't at the table. Do you not think that somewhat undermines some of the conversation we've been having around strengthening and building those relationships and being involved in the conversations when you have organisations like this, which we are nominally party to, actually aren't engaging with us at all?
Certainly, I think part of the issues that were brought up in the BIPA report, although you're right, we were only mentioned once, and much of the interaction was really about the broader issues between the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, and EU connections and challenges that sat within that space. There are other opportunities for us to raise some of the issues that come up with this. So, for example, in British Irish Council, for example, the issues of subsea connectivity, the cabling connectivity, the issues that sit around immigration, tend to be brought up in what would be, ministerially, perhaps a more appropriate forum than referring back through BIPA. It's not that we wouldn't, but we were mentioned very little. It came to us, through a different route rather than coming to us directly. British Irish Council would tend to be the place where we'd pick that up, either at an official level or a ministerial level. Don't say anything you want to.
And I think that's kind of what I'm asking. So, as part of the horizon scanning that you're doing, I mean, this piece of work that BIPA did started back in May 2023.
Yeah.
Their published terms of reference talks around how the UK, Ireland, and the Crown dependencies can cooperate on some of these matters. But you waited to be contacted, or not contacted, as the case may be. It doesn't appear to have been any horizon scanning that said, oh, actually, this group of people are talking about the Crown dependencies, or talking about the Isle of Man. Sure. Should we get involved? Did that thought process happen? Did that engagement process happen?
Maybe I should sort of reinforce it that, you know, at an official level, that those conversations. We talk to the Minister of Justice weekly. We've got a secure communications process for more sensitive information. Certainly, which, you know, at an official level I have access to, and which we rely upon that. So it's not as though these things are never on our horizon, or that we don't discuss them with them. There are just a broad variety of channels in which that could sort of take place. And it might have been that response to BIPA might not have been the most appropriate way for that to have happened, but I give you every assurance that A, that horizon scanning does take place, B, those conversations do take place, and C, we take, you know, joint action between ourselves and our neighbouring jurisdictions as to what we might do to mitigate some of the challenges within that.
So I think it's an interesting point that you've picked up on, particularly with the BIPA report. I don't know if you were aware, but there was it happened to cross my desk as a sort of byproduct of a discussion I was having, but there was a full sort of security committee, and I can't remember exactly which name committee it was in Westminster, did a whole piece on UK and Irish infrastructure, in particular though, the cabling and connectivity around the Isle of Man was very much highlighted in that report. That then obviously was then published, presumably picked up by the relevant defence agencies. It's quite a question you're asking in terms of, okay, so we've got all this infrastructure, we're really actually very much at the heart of the sort of national security, if you like, not just for the Isle of Man, national security for the Isle of Man, in terms of our communications infrastructure, but also Great Britain and Ireland as a whole. As part of the engagements that we've had, I've had chance time to time to meet the chiefs of the defence staff and one or two other senior military officials, you know, to talk about the Isle of Man and its cabling, and I think they've indicated to me this is very much an issue that is very much at the forefront of their thinking at the moment. But I guess asking them to be clearer about how and what sort of defensive mechanisms are then put in place is going to be probably difficult, because they're unlikely to want to necessarily share very sensitive information beyond this. But I think we take your point, which is
the question that I'm really asking is, all this stuff is going on around us. The UK and Ireland are obviously engaged in these conversations, and a lot of this will impact on what happens to the Isle of Man. Are you assured that when the UK are looking at putting in place whatever measures they're putting in place, that the Isle of Man is actively engaged in those conversations to make sure that the cabling that we're reliant on, not just for our electricity, but also economically as well for some of the stuff that exists, are you assured that we are involved as we need to be in those conversations, and that we won't be accidentally forgotten because some leadership in the UK has changed and they've completely forgotten that the Isle of Man exists? I think that's the assurance that I'm seeking, is that the government, whether you have all the detail or not, obviously that's an operational matter, but are you assured yourselves that when these conversations are going on, when this work is going on, that the Isle of Man is involved as much as we need to be to protect our national interest?
At an official level, I receive a specific security briefing via the MOJ, as required, and then generally on a regular basis to make sure that I'm up to date. That obviously informs the thinking that then continues to go on here. Recently, the Chief Minister and I both met with Dan Jarvis, who's the Security Minister at the Cabinet Office, as well as at the Home Office, raised the issue about how we could enhance the exchange of information on counter-terrorism, for example, between the Isle of Man Constabulary and UK constabularies. So we are proactive in this space. We do lean into it. We obviously keep it restricted, because that's what it is. But there isn't anything that I can tell you from an official level that we've sort of sat back and thought, oh, cool, we really ought to have been involved in all that. I think from an official level, I think we've been included as comprehensively as we ought to have been.
I think I'm, would agree with you that I think certainly at the highest level, that reassurance that, our cabling, our position, our connectivity is being properly included within the overall defence assessments that are being undertaken would be potentially useful. It's actually something that I have sought to address when I've been at things like, for example, the British Irish Council, in terms of just discussing it at a general level. And I'm certainly aware, as this report will indicate, in any case, those discussions between Ireland and the United Kingdom were ongoing and were quite advanced. But I guess our positioning within that would be usefully clarified, and it's certainly something actually I'm quite happy to take away, how that is potentially shared in terms of relaying that, but for us to have that confidence at the most senior level that yes, that is very much part of the thinking would be quite useful, I think, Chris, at one point.
Yeah, I think from a committee perspective, we wouldn't expect you necessarily to share and publish that, but actually being able to circulate that, the fact that you are yourselves reassured, that would be enough, I think, at this stage.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Okay. So the National Infrastructure Security Bill recognised the fact that it's a Department for Home Affairs piece of legislation, but also that it kind of crosses over into external relations matters and Cabinet Office probably more generally. But that having been consulted on, can you just give us an overview of what exactly that's intended to do, to start?
To protect, effectively, obviously to protect our national infrastructure and place a duty on those responsible for maintaining that national infrastructure to ensure that it is maintained and protected to its specified standards. I think for the most part those standards are in existence, but we need to reinforce that and also propose as powers to take action in the event that certain high-risk vendors are identified within our critical national infrastructure, who may potentially pose a risk to the island's national security.
Has external relations been involved in the policy input into that piece of legislation? Not at all? No. Okay. Well, then we'd best move on. Mr. Peters?
Royal Assent. There's been quite a lot of concern recently about Royal Assent effectively being withheld as far as our assisted dying bill is concerned. What's the Isle of Man government doing to speed that up? Because I appreciate that even in our own parliament it was a fairly divisive issue. So is that slowing it down, or is this politics from the UK?
Well, as far as we understand, the bill is with the Ministry of Justice. Just to be clear, as far as I understand, Royal Assent has not been refused in any way. I think the role of the Ministry of Justice in this process is to recommend the piece of legislation, which is normal practice for Royal Assent. They assess that legislation against a variety of international standards. My understanding is that they are continuing to do that and will proceed in due course. My understanding is that is under active consideration and that process should happen.
There's regular consultation between ourselves and the Ministry of Justice. As I say, we have scheduled fortnightly meetings with the MOJ about all matters that go on between the United Kingdom and the Isle of Man. I think in the case of the assisted dying bill, our regular consultation over this for months and months has just been making sure that everything is going as smoothly as it possibly sort of can be. There's probably an incumbent responsibility on the United Kingdom to ensure that for such a piece of groundbreaking and consequential legislation that it is being subject to the diligence that it would be expected to be. It's difficult to say whether it's unprecedented or not. It is probably more appropriate to say that in the way that this has been dealt with between each of us, it's received the due attention that it deserves to make sure that it is effective as it can be, and then it's going to come back to us in a reasonable time frame. But for simpler, straightforward, non-groundbreaking bills or bills that don't have quite the sort of same degrees of consequence of being passed, they tend to go forward in a much more sort of straightforward manner. But from an official perspective, I think when we've gone back to check on details of when was the last time something took this long, it sort of occurs once every sort of couple of decades or so, but not more frequently than that. So we are assured from our conversations with the Ministry of Justice, from our discussions with the relevant ministers, that this is just going through a due process without any delay, because of the nature of the bill.
If it became apparent that the UK government was trying to block this bill, what would our response to that be?
I think, well, we're not clear exactly at the moment all the precise nuances of what the fundamental issues are, other than the fact that the Healthcare Minister has published some correspondence pertaining to questions that were put from the Ministry of Justice. That has been made public. That letter has gone back to the Ministry of Justice. As we understand it, they are assessing that, and they will make their recommendations promptly, or as promptly as possible. And we understand that is going to be fairly soon. Can't put that into days or weeks.
Not really. I mean, part of the key piece has been the assurance that the bill complies with international obligations that apply to both the United Kingdom and to the Isle of Man. That would appear to be the piece that's taking up the most time in.
So you're happy that the process is working properly?
I'm
so far
very assured by the conversations, the regular conversations and the candid conversations we've had with the Ministry of Justice.
Okay. Moving on to the election in September, when the implementation of changes made to the electoral system, how might the next general election differ from previous elections?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question, Mr. Peters.
With the implementation of changes made to the electoral system, how might the next election differ from previous ones?
Can you just be a bit clearer on the
the
specific changes that you think might impact the election in terms of how differently it's run compared to?
So there were a number of changes made in the most recent
There were
legislation that would impact things like election meetings, for example, or declarations. I suppose the question Mr. Peters is asking is just how do you envisage those changes actually having an impact on the ground?
So voters can use any polling station in the constituency, for example. Is an amendment since the last election. There's more transparency involved, so there's more publication of candidates' declarations of relevant interest have been brought through and introduced. We have looked at digital registers, developments of the electronic register, such as the rollout of any polling station voting in elections. There have been improvements to online registration. We've now got 12 pre-election meetings. That's one per constituency rather than one per parish. So there's a number of indicators there as to how it will differ, how it will feel different for voters voting within their constituencies.
I don't think on the ground on the day it's going to make much material difference, but I think the advances, the online registration, etc., should give more people potentially the opportunity of ensuring they're correctly registered. In other words, potentially more people should be aware and able, in fact, should be capable of checking that they are properly registered and get themselves registered, if they so wish to do so, quickly and efficiently through the online process. I think, yes, that hopefully will be the biggest advance, and potentially one would hope that may mean potentially we might see hopefully some increase in the voting numbers.
Well, that was my final question. It's an old chestnut, but how do we get more people out to vote, especially younger people?
Well, obviously there are commitments. I think Chris, you're planning some public engagements.
We've got a series of public engagements planned recently. That was in response to a challenge that had come in to say how are we enabling younger voters to develop a greater understanding of it. We have I know we've imitated a very successful recent public engagement scheme to ensure that we're getting in the same places. So we've seen where they've succeeded and making sure that we are attempting to mimic that success and ensuring there's greater accessibility at the places where younger voters are involved. And I know that we have a schedule, which I don't have right in front of me, but I know we have a schedule of events set for the whole of the summer in the run-up toward the election that are starting shortly, and by shortly I mean in the next few days, as well as the next few weeks, to ensure that visibility is being produced. There is a regular and should be well publicised approach to encourage more people to go out and exercise their right to vote come September.
Do you think there's more that could be done though in terms of like getting our young people on board with going out to the polling stations? And is that the job of external relations, do you think? Crown and elections, yeah.
Responsibility of the individual voter. But in terms of encouraging people, why it's relevant, why it's important, we can run that engagement campaign and that information campaign to ensure that people understand what their responsibility starts at that age and what they ought to be doing and what the consequences of it are and how that can come through. That I know that's part of the engagement scheme that we're looking to put into effect. So.
Can I ask you, you've mentioned quite a bit about moving things online, the registration process, the updating process, all that kind of thing. Do you not feel there's a real risk of leaving a lot of people behind here? Accessing government services face-to-face when you don't live in Douglas, you don't have easy access to government offices in central Douglas is quite difficult for people. I know, for example, I happened to be in the Cabinet Office when a couple just happened to walk in with the paperwork that they had to struggle to get hold of copies of physical papers to be able to physically update their details because they don't use online services in any way, shape or form. And actually by moving everything online by default, by actually not having easily returnable paper forms, by not having a local office people can drop things into, do you not feel you're at risk here of potentially disenfranchising voters who may otherwise have been able to more easily access and update the systems? Now everything's moving online. There's a lot of people actually that either can't or won't access government services online.
So broadly, the broad attempt has been to ensure that there are opportunities for everyone to be able to. There's a variety of ways in which you can return your information. I appreciate the point that people may be disinclined toward doing it in a particular format, but we haven't necessarily removed any of the previous methods of being able to come and register. We're looking to make a transition toward changing demographics. That there are an equal number, one might suggest, who only do everything online. Who literally live off, if they don't have a telephone or mobile device in their hand, can't do anything. That their ID's on there, their wallets on there, their Netflix subscriptions on there. I'm being facetious, but there's an element to that where the idea of writing something down on paper is anathema to another part of the demographic.
I fully appreciate that, being one of those people myself. But actually, the reality is there are lots of people equally who can't do that for whatever reason. And whilst you're saying you're not removing these options, if someone wanted to, for example, return the paper form they got in the recent electoral canvass, they would either have to call the Cabinet Office and request a prepaid envelope, or make their way into Douglas to hand deliver it to the Cabinet Office, or post it themselves. Now, fair enough, but actually that is an additional barrier to entry for those people, which is unnecessary. So actually people may think, well, I can't be bothered with all that. I'm not going to bother updating my details, which means because I'm not going to vote anyway because all the politicians are the same. What's the point? Actually, by making it slightly harder for people, you are potentially discouraging them from engaging in the whole process. So as many public engagement events, you can host as many of those as you like. If people actually can't vote because they haven't been able to update their details in an easy and convenient way, you're actually, the net effect of this is going to be worse for us as an island.
We've tried to enable as many methods as possible for people to be able to both register and then to be able to vote, including, as you sort of say, with a little bit of with a bit of free post, with being able to call the Cabinet Office, and I know that the team have worked hard to ensure that anyone who has had any issues about being able to access the information or think about how that forms have been returned, there's been exactly the human touch that you would expect from people to be able to help provide, enable voters to be able to come through and deliver their registration. We are following electoral best practice, and my team have been recently been to the Electoral Administrators Conference in the United Kingdom to make sure that we are as up to date and as aware of all the challenges, exactly as you described, Mr. Hooper, that we would look to be able to overcome and provide a sort of positive response for. We've seen mixed responses around the island for how many people do want to, and it tends to be quite sort of regional and localised. So in terms of removing impediments, we've tried everything that we can do in line with best practice to ensure that that is the case, whilst maintaining that overall strategic objective of making, not losing another tranche of voters who don't want to. So trying to meet the requirements at both ends of that demographic spectrum are challenging. That's inevitable because we're at a sort of turning point in the way that people like to process their information and run through their forms. But we have set out to create as much enablement about that as we possibly can. And I think in addition to which, I certainly know from watching the team go about this that they have probably gone beyond what's expected of them in helping people to come through and register that.
It's probably something, Chris, that you can sort of check in on in a month's time or something.
Yeah.
So you've said that you've had a varying response regionally. Is it your intention to do more in those regions where you've had a worse response? You said I'm getting at is actually those areas where you've had high response and return rates, actually you're probably okay, but in those parts of the island where you are seeing lower response, lower returns, are you going to step up your public engagement in those areas?
Yeah, so for example, my team tell me that in Ramsey in particular, there have been lots of paper forms returned to the local authority office.
It will be.
As sort of one example of that. So we can tailor some of the response and the engagement that we'll have around the island to make sure that if we think that there is a particular approach or degree of sort of common understanding about the way that it might work as we get close to the election, we can tailor the response to meet those rather than doing a one-size-fits-all.
Okay.
Do you have a question? Anything else from yourself, Mr. Hooper?
Not on electoral registration, no, that's fine.
Anything else generally?
Just one thing, actually, which is back to the topic around the National Infrastructure Bill, where you said you haven't been engaged under policy considerations. We recently had a chance to talk to the Department of Home Affairs in an evidence session where they talked about potentially introducing, I should say, a requirement for ID at borders. So if you need to travel on a boat or whatever, having to present some form of ID. Have external relations been involved in any of that work from a CTA perspective? So the potential impact that might have on the CTA and making sure any of our requirements that might come in are aligned with what is expected of us as a member of the CTA?
Only in as much as that members of the team have provided advice interdepartmentally to remind people about what the obligations and the consequences and the regulations around the common travel area are. But
so if there'd been any issues as a result of that kind of work, you would have obviously you'd have flagged that up to them and you'd have been aware of it.
No, we haven't been asked to pick up any particular work stream on that.
Okay.
I'll ask a question of the Chief Minister, if I would, and it may or may not be a cheeky question, so I apologise in advance. Around 8-9 years ago, we had an external relations director. We've had a couple, including yourself, Mr. Brannigan, since. And it seemed at the time quite a streamlined approach, albeit one individual that was very strongly at the centre of all of that. Do you think that we have just as strong a system now as we did then? Having been around over the course of that period of time in the Council of Ministers, chair of the PAC, in a number of different positions politically, to have some eyes across, how things have been progressing, are we in just as strong a position with external relations as we were at that point in time?
It's really hard for me to other than give a sort of generic impression of that, because clearly, for the last 5 years I've been working very, very closely with external relations. Prior to that, whilst I accompanied the Chief Minister as Treasury Minister on external relations visits, went to British Irish Council and went down to Westminster from time to time. The very specific nuances of some of the work he was undertaking at that time wouldn't necessarily be visible to me necessarily, from an open perspective. Look, I think the external relations team are doing a very good job. It is quite complex. They're multifaceted, from Europe, to governments trying to re-establish free trade agreements, to international matters around immigration, international matters around energy provision, energy supply. So I feel that we've got a very good, strong representation, from external relations. I think, like everything else, there's always room to refocus and ensure that we're delivering, in the right areas. But I'd say it's as strong as it's ever been.
And another cheeky question as well for yourself, Mr. Brannigan. The previous maybe 2 external relations directors that we've had over the course of the last 5 years both met briefly with Della Fletcher, who was here quite some considerable time ago, and I'm sure that the Chief Minister understands why I've just asked him the question that I've just asked him. Have you spent any time with Ms. Fletcher to discuss with her your approach and whether or not there might be any sort of synergies or otherwise that might improve processes and improve strategic direction?
Sure. So the short answer to that is no, I haven't. I'm still in real terms quite new at this. New at this role rather than new at the tradecraft involved in external relations, but new at this role. And I've been very conscious since taking over that I've got some real strengths of resource in the team, as they sit at the moment, and I'm very clear that part of what I'm looking to do is to find ways of bringing on talent within the team and through all aspects of the team. And I've been looking for where there is mentoring and role modelling and all of those approaches to take place. And candidly, I've been looking at how I can do that for my team members rather than thinking about how I do it for myself, because we all have a responsibility to ensure that we are as professionally developed as we can be. That's the point, without letting the cat out of the bag, at which I'd really like to have that sort of long, in-depth conversation with Della Fletcher to look at how that has sort of been in the past. But my focus has been elsewhere on sort of resources of my staff rather than upon my personal development. That's something I need to address within my own scheme for the coming 12 months.
Good news, I think. And on that, unless there's anything else that you'd like to add, any closing remarks you'd like to make?
No, thank you.
Well, in that case, the committee will now sit in private. Thank you so much for attending, Chief Minister, and also
Thank
Mr.
you.
Brannigan.